So while we're waiting to get started, maybe I should talk a little about the prehistory of crypto in the 1990s, which is where really all of this stuff began. Um, so in the 1990s, crypto was a very, very different world. It was pre-blockchain. It was very much a world that was dominated by email. Even the web didn't have any cryptography. There was no HTTPS. All that we really had was a program called PGP and the ability to encrypt emails. One person wanted to send a message to another. You did a key exchange. You encrypted the email, often at the command line on a Unix box, and then you would send an email. And that seems like prehistory, but that's really 25 years ago. And from that, we've basically gone through probably 3 or 4 major stages of building out the crypto ecosystem that we have today. Getting crypto built into the web browsers and into the infrastructure of the internet was the thing that enabled e-commerce, and that was probably the single largest transformation that we've ever seen in terms of mass consumer adoption of cryptography. And then the other huge transformation was the creation of SIM cards. So SIM cards and bank cards that have chip and pin and the rest of these kind of things were the first real large-scale adoption of hardware cryptography. That was when we started having cryptographic algorithms embedded in chips, which gave you a completely new kind of security. And then the next turning point really after that is the Bitcoin white paper. But we're coming into this story really with 25 years of history here and 25 years of accelerating momentum. And it's easy to forget that the cryptography built into web browsers is the thing that created multiple trillions of dollars of value in the form of the entire e-commerce ecosystem, and then the Web 2 ecosystem that survives on advertising, largely driven by e-commerce. All of that was cryptography. And prior to the building of the crypto into the web browsers, there was no e-commerce, there were no credit card transactions online, there was really nothing but documents. So we've already gone through one almost industrial revolution in real world asset trading driven by crypto, and we're now getting ready for the next. Are we ready to start more formally? Is everybody here that needs to be? Okay, so just to continue a little, we've also seen waves of resistance. So in the 1990s, the US government freaked out and reclassified cryptography as munitions. They literally said that encryption was armaments, and it became illegal to export from America without a license. This was called the ITAR regulations. And ITAR drove a huge number of cryptographers out of America. A lot of those folks wound up in a place called Anguilla, and there was a kind of early crypto island community there. That's also where you began to see the hybridization of offshore finance and cryptography. And some people would suggest that that was sort of where you got the birth of some of the stuff that became crypto economics. We started in the late 1990s. 2005, there was the fall of eGold. eGold was a perfectly reasonable gold-backed digital currency system, fully centralized, no real use of crypto. It was a very successful platform. You could transfer $100,000 from one cell phone to another cell phone in the late 1990s for 50 cents instantaneously. And that was all gold-backed. It was essentially gold-backed stablecoins. And that system was shut down in 2005. And I would say that almost everybody thinks of the fall of eGold as being the thing that triggered Bitcoin. Because it was a case of like, if there was going to be another eGold and it was not going to get shut down by the government, it was going to have to be decentralized. And to me, the fall of eGold is really the impetus for the creation of Bitcoin. I think that was kind of the response from the crypto community to eGold was Bitcoin. So we are standing very much on the shoulders of giants, and I was sort of an observer in those days. I used the eGold ecosystem bit. I wrote some cryptographic applications in the 1990s, but I was by no means, any kind of figure in the space. I was very much a follower in those days. And it wasn't really until the days of Ethereum that I began to show any kind of leadership and actually get more involved. Okay. I reckon that's enough for the history lesson. Shall we get started? Are we ready to go?
I think we're ready to go. I think I'm going to take lead. I apologize for the delay, everyone. But Vinny, thank you so much for the background and history. I think that was amazing. Gio will just jump in whenever he can. But before we unravel developments, I just wanted to thank everyone again for joining us today. It's an amazing opportunity to have you here with us, Vinay, and just like learn more about what you're doing. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. The concept of fractional ownership is still relatively new to many people. Can you briefly explain how it works and how it might redefine our future?
So fractional ownership is kind of how the real world works. Everything in the world that is big, and I'm thinking here big like electrical grids, airlines, large scale real estate developments in many cases, these things don't just have a single owner. There isn't just a single monopoly of, like this person owns the electrical grid. Not how it works. What you have is publicly traded companies, which in the UK they call publicly listed companies. So that's your Facebooks and your Apples and your Amazons and your IBMs. They have stock, and just about anybody in the world can go buy that stock, and they can buy it and they can sell it and they can trade it. And those companies are massive. They're very, very heavily regulated. And that's how things like electrical grids get built. It's just normal that the big stuff, the companies that make the cancer drugs, the companies that dig up the oil and the coal and the gasoline and all the rest of that stuff, the car companies. You just sort of naturally assume that these things you could go out and you could buy equity in them, you could buy stock. The world is built on fractional ownership because really these things are too important and too powerful to be owned by a single individual that could change their mind about how they're going to work overnight. Right? And you can see this a little bit with the politics around Twitter itself, where because it was something that could be bought and sold by a single individual, once it was bought by Elon Musk, everything changed. Publicly listed companies, publicly traded companies don't work like that. They have governance, the change is much more slow, it's much more moderated, and that's why they tend to be trusted to do things like run electrical grids. So it's not that we're kind of inventing fractional ownership from scratch. Fractional ownership is how the world works. But what we're doing is we're using the efficiency of the blockchain to apply this kind of fractional ownership concept to much smaller things in a much more inexpensive and lightweight way. And that brings the benefits of this kind of fractional ownership model and the associated governance right down to the point where you can begin to imagine doing it for individual cars, individual houses, individual works of art, rather than thinking more at the scale of an airline or an electrical grid or a utility that serves, hundreds of millions of users a day on the internet.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Now, like with fractional ownership, I know you mentioned doing cars and potentially real estate and things like that. So in the future, instead of having like, let's say, millennials are now uh, trying to visit the world and we don't want to have a single home, we want to have multiple options. So would this essentially be an opportunity to build some sort of model which allows you to own a fraction of an ownership in different various parts of the world when it comes to real estate or different assets?
Yes, I think that's relatively easy to put together. So here I'm going to introduce a concept of granularity, right? We're going to probably come into this a couple more times. So say that we're going to have a situation where you're sharing 10 homes in this kind of fractional way, right? One way that you could do that is you could put all of those homes into an enormous bag called something like a real estate investment trust, and then everybody could take 10%, 2%, 5%, and they would equally own one part of each one of those 10 homes. And it could be 10,000 homes. So this one model, that's the kind of trust model. Everything is kind of in a single bucket and you own little pieces of the bucket. And that's a perfectly practical, reasonable way of doing things, and it has a lot of advantages. But the other approach is that you could take these places individually and tokenize them. And at that point, you could own more of the places you spend a lot of time in and less of the places you don't spend very much time in. And then instead of every person having the same strategy and the same portfolio and they just own different percentages of it, you could actually decide you want to own more of the stuff in Bali and less of the stuff in Hong Kong, and somebody else decides they want more of the stuff in Hong Kong and less of the stuff in Bali. And so you get this ability for each person to shape their own investment strategy and their own deployment of resources. And then maybe at some point you decide you've had enough of the fractional ownership lifestyle. You sell all of your equity in all of these assets to somebody else, and then you take that and you buy 70% of a house that you're the majority owner in, and that's your primary residence, and you live there from then on.
Wow, I absolutely love this model, and I think many of the individuals in this call will probably enjoy something like that as well. So I know that you've played a pivotal role in Ethereum's launch. What lessons have you brought from that experience to shape the vision and strategy of Matrim?
So this is kind of a hard question for me because, to be honest, I'm really quite disappointed in the way that things have gone since Ethereum was launched. Um, there's a video from the early days of Ethereum, mid 2015, called Ethereum the World Computer. And it really lays down a vision where Ethereum is going to be used to do things like uh, auction off the slots for air traffic control. You want to land a plane, you book a slot in 2 weeks, you decide you're not going to charter that plane, you sell off the slot, and it's a token. They talk about real estate, electrical grids, satellite infrastructure. There's this whole notion of we're just going to tokenize the real world assets. And what's going to happen is you're going to get these new efficient economies that will enable just a much better deployment of capital globally to get better goods and better services available for people with less waste and less inefficiency. And that was the vision that I think everybody in the Ethereum team shared 2013, 2014, 2015. There was no notion in the early days of Ethereum that there was a digital world and a physical world, and they played by two completely different sets of rules and they didn't really touch. The idea was that we were going to roll out infrastructure directly into the physical world and it was going to touch everything. And then it didn't happen. And the way that I think about Ethereum is that Ethereum and the blockchain in general, in fact, is like an enormous engine. And it's an enormous engine in an enormous vehicle. And the problem is the engine is not connected to the wheels because there's no gearbox. It doesn't matter how hard you rev the ICOs in 2018, how hard you rev DeFi in the DeFi summer, how hard you rev the NFTs. The wheels don't turn, right? And I could see that problem happening. Really, 2016, it became clear that we were having a real problem getting traction because the lawyers kept not approving the things that were going to be world changing. And I realized that I had to go off and I had to fix the legal problem. I had to go out there and figure out how we were going to get the lawyers on board. Because until the lawyers started saying yes rather than no to the deals, we couldn't get access at the real world. So when I started Mattereum, what I said was our customer is the general counsel or chief legal officer of a Fortune 500 company that controls a bunch of real world assets, right? The people that actually have the yes or no legally when you want to touch the real world, these are our customers. And we have to figure out how to get them to say yes to blockchain transactions in their asset classes. And I figured it was going to take us a couple of years of research, a couple of years of prototyping. The pandemic got in the middle of that and really slowed us down quite a lot. It took us 4 years to get to the first live transactions and 6 years to get to the point where we could do securitization. But we're now at a point where we have the adapter, we have the connector, which makes it possible to legally control pretty much any asset in pretty much any country in the world in a way that the lawyers will approve of. Right now, there's a bunch of work to be done in some jurisdictions. There are some countries it will simply never work in, but the kind of core commercial structure of the entire world is now accessible to the blockchain. You have to bring lawyers. There is always detail to be done, but generally speaking, we've got the paradigm in place, and we've got the worked examples, and we've got the legal analysis, and we can do this now. So I think of this as being kind of back to the future. We can go back to the 2013, 14, 15 vision, and now we can implement it fully. And we've got the gearbox. So now when you run the Ethereum engine, the wheels turn and the vehicle will move and the real world will come with us.
Wow, that's incredible. Now, Materium's journey is one of technological transformation and innovation. Could you share some of the most memorable milestones you and your team have experienced along the way?
Yes. So I'll tell you a funny little English story because we're a very English company in some ways. Um, I get invited by a friend that I know through Mattereum to have a lunch with the judges of one of the highest courts in the UK to keep the judges in contact with the real world. Every day they have a lunch and they bring in some invited guests from all walks of life and they sit down and they have a conversation with the judges over lunch. And then the judges go back to hear the afternoon's cases, and they do this to keep everybody kind of connected to the real world and aware of how the public thinks. And so they serve you a nice glass of wine while you're waiting, and then the judges get finished with their morning cases, and they all come down, and they walk in, and these are some of the most powerful, sort of adjudicators of law in the world, and they're all dressed as Santa Claus. It's red robes with white fur trimming, and it's literally just a wall of Santas walks in, and I very nearly completely lose it at that point. And this was kind of typical of the process of beginning to understand how the real world works. Because the real world, particularly the legal aspects of the real world, are filled with things that seem completely absurd to people that grew up on Star Trek and worked with technology for their whole careers. Law is old. Citing a case from 600 years ago happens semi-routinely when you start dealing with things like real estate law. 800, 1,000 years, even longer in some cases. And so what you have is this very, very ancient world that you're suddenly plugged into, and it's like bridging time. So, we got sort of familiar with this ancient world of law, and then the first set of NFTs that were bound to physical things by Mattereum was a collection for William Shatner, the actor from Star Trek. So it was kind of like Captain Kirk swag for sale on OpenSea, and you can still find those things on OpenSea. They're there. And it was just the sense of being kind of stretched across time. So that was completely amazing. Other big deals. The first time we supported the sale of a gold bar as an NFT, that was amazing. I mean, gold bullion is it's so tangible, and it was such a throwback to e-gold. The last time that you had tokenized exchange of digital gold in any kind of real way was really the sort of early 2000s. So, to see individual numbered allocated bars in a vault change hands as an NFT was amazing. Because that was the point where we knew that we could do this for if you could do it for one gold bar, you can do it for all gold bars. A gold bar in a vault gets the same level of security whether it weighs 100 grams or 12 and a half kilos. So that was the opening of okay, now we can do gold. This is it. We're doing this for real. And then real estate was the other big thing. Late last year we got the first real estate listing on chain using all of our kind of legal and risk management approaches, and that was it's like, oh, that's the biggest asset class in the world, and it's coming along for the ride now. And these things are very much to use this kind of gearbox model. These are gears in the gearbox. Collectibles, gold bullion, and other vaulted assets like wine or fine art, things that live in climate controlled storage. And real estate, those three asset classes together, I mean, real estate is 300 trillion of assets and it's 3 trillion of transactions a year. Gold bullion, the numbers are staggering because of the stuff trades like FX. But there's somewhere between $1 and $200 billion of gold that comes out of the ground every year. I mean, this stuff is it's the backbone of the real world. And every time we got a new asset class in one of those backbone areas, it was like, oh, this is really happening. We're moving away from Ethereum as a thing that largely exists in the ethereal realm. You make up a new kind of property, you document it in the form of a smart contract, you then exchange this new form of property with other people that believe in that new form of property holding value. Very, very, very airy, very, very, very esoteric, very, very ethereal, right? Into gold bricks, which are about as dense as a thing can get, into real estate. It's the stuff that you're literally standing on. So for us, the Mattereum name has taken on more and more meaning as from the ethereal to the material. It's the bringing of the blockchain to Earth, grounding it in the real world. It's kind of blockchain touches grass.
Wow, that's absolutely incredible. And, just to think of all of the regulatory moves and requirements that all of this took is just mind-boggling. And to think that we've gotten so far in so few years. I think Gio is on the line now. Gio, do you have any questions or?
Yeah, can you hear me, guys? So apologies for the technical issues here. I finally fixed the issue. So yeah, apologies, Vinay, for this. If Jessica, it's okay for you, I can pick up the conversation from here.
Of course.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. So So I would like to move on with the following question, which is about your partnership with Swarm for fractional ownership. So Mattereum recently announced a partnership with Swarm for fractional ownership tokens. So could you tell us more about this collaboration?
Sure, absolutely. So Swarm is a really, really well-established company in the crypto space. I think they go back to maybe 2014. They've gone through a lot of phases, they've gone through a lot of changes, but the kind of core proposition is that they sat down in Germany, and in Germany, the way that crypto works is it's just regarded as being financial instruments, pretty much. I'm not a German lawyer, this is not legal advice, but a lot of countries basically sort of decided that crypto was its own special thing and they were going to regulate it as a special thing in its own way. The Germans were just like, looks like a financial instrument, smells like a financial instrument, come back when you have a banking license. Come back when you're a regulated financial services institution. They just put the same criteria around crypto as you would for any other class of financial instruments that were issued in the normal way, the old-fashioned way, the TradFi way. So Swarm just buckled down and did the regulatory heavy lift and got their licenses, and now they are just real-world finance in Germany, but they have a license that lets them do things with crypto, and they've got the attitude, they've got the experience, they've got the institutional knowledge. So they're not really TradFi and they're not really DeFi. They're just finance. They don't have the kind of whizzy kind of craziness of DeFi. They also don't have the dullness of traditional finance. They use the blockchain to get things done. And they're exactly the kind of institution that we thought the mainstream banks were going to turn into in the sort of 2016 era. All of the big banks were coming to the table and looking at Ethereum. All of them were talking about use cases. They had all the necessary licensing. But what they kind of lacked was the vision. The governments in America and in the UK gave them no confidence about what the position would be. So they kind of backed away. Right? The Germans, generally my read, not an expert, generally my read, is that the Germans just explained the rules of the game and said anybody that plays by these rules is entitled to play, welcome to the table. And then it took years to get through the hoop jumping and the compliance issues until they were fully empowered. And to me, it's basically the critical feature of getting us back onto the track where we go into the real world in a big way. Because if the banks had said yes to a bunch of this stuff in 2016, we would all be far, far farther ahead than we are now. And Swarm is essentially akin to those banks, only instead of saying no, they said yes, and they're very heavily invested in making this stuff real. So I would say it's the first really serious way of joining together TradFi and DeFi, and then Mattereum comes in and says, okay, well, so you want to do something like take 1,000 acres of rainforest. You want to take an industrial facility. You want to take a collection of fine art that's been accumulated over a few centuries. You want to take these things and you want to split them into shares and allow people to buy them. You want to split them into tokens and allow people to buy them. You want to take revenue streams and allow people to buy into those. You want to do governance. All of these things, you have to know for damn sure that the assets are real and there's no fraud in the assets. You need insurance, you need underwriting. You need machine readable definitions of the assets so that you can do things like automated investment portfolio management. All of these kinds of things, those are not the natural functions of a stock exchange. They're not the natural functions of a bank. They're not the natural functions of Swarm. You need external entities that put together the deals. And Mattereum is one of the kind of more audit-like entities that helps put together the deals. Right. In the real world, Mattereum might be seen as being something a bit like KPMG or one of the other big four accounting firms. It could have some overlap with the kind of stuff that some of the more entrepreneurial merchant functions kind of are there. But what we're sort of seeing here is the build out of real world finance, neither TradFi or DeFi, but real world finance with many of the same kinds of business models that you get in the real world, but all implemented on the new technological backbone. And this is really what we always thought Ethereum was going to be. This is back to the original vision. We can now implement all the stuff that we talked about nearly 10 years ago.
Awesome. And Yeah, I noticed that you also made an interesting metaphor concerning Star Wars. You said that if Ethereum was a Jedi, Swarm is the lightsaber, because it's going to cut right through the separation between the Ethereum community and the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Because, you know, once we can get through that door, right, once you can buy and sell 20% of a house as Ethereum tokens in a way that is government approved, and that any lawyer who's involved in the deal can read the paperwork and go, sure, that's fine, that's just a transaction. You know, how different would it be if all of the enthusiasm around NFTs a couple of years ago had been instruments that had durable value like real estate or gold or fine art? You wouldn't have a situation where there was this sudden popping of a bubble. I mean, real estate bubbles pop, but when a real estate bubble pops, people lose 20% of their value, right? When a token bubble pops, people lose, you know, 99.9% of their value. And so what's been happening is we've been getting this very kind of frothy, very delicate kind of enthusiasm, where the enthusiasm goes away and then suddenly all the money goes away. But we could do real world stuff, and then you buy something and it doesn't have this kind of inherent volatility. Because what you're not buying is, does this asset class really exist or not? Which is where we are with NFTs, it's where we are with DeFi, it's where we are with ICO tokens. You're not making a bet on whether the asset class turns into something. You're taking an asset class that in some instances is tens of thousands of years old, and you're making a bet on an individual thing inside of that asset class. It's a completely different kind of risk. It's much lower risk in most cases. It's certainly a much more easy to understand risk. And it doesn't have the same kind of correlation, because even if one piece of real estate turns out to be a bad deal, somewhere in the world, all the rest of the real estate is much the same as it ever was.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. The tokenization of assets is a very fascinating topic. And yeah, now I would like you to explain people that might not be so familiar with the use cases, the real world use cases for these tokens. What would those real world use cases be?
So basically, right now, the only way to buy things, if you can't afford them yourself, is credit, right? You want something, the thing is expensive. You need something, the thing is expensive. The only way that you're going to get that thing is if you can borrow money from one or more people, and then you take all of that money, you buy the thing outright, and now there's your thing, right? And that as an approach involves paying interest, right? 2%, 3% for a long time when interest rates were super low. Now interest rates are high, 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 and they're probably going to go higher. And you start thinking like 30% APR on credit cards, and even higher instances in some instances. But even the core borrowing from like bank base rates, the interest rate numbers going up and up and up. It's getting more and more and more difficult and dangerous to use debt to finance things. The other way of doing this thing is you get people together to buy things collectively. Equity, right? Hey, I want to buy this thing. I can't afford it. How's about I take 2/3 of it and you take 1/3 of it, right? How would that be? Oh, yeah, that's fine. Sure. Absolutely. Right. Now, if that's something like a, riding a lawnmower, then you sort of divide this up in terms of who's going to use it when, and you're sort of dividing these things up in time, right? That is a very, very small set of use cases. Most of the time, what people do is they divide things up in terms of value. Here is an enormous building. 4 different companies each put money into that building. One of them owns 5%, one of them owns 10%, one of them owns 25%, the other one owns the rest of the building. Right? And then there are rules, governance, for how the entities that all own parts of the thing interact. And if you get to the really big scale things like publicly traded companies, you could have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of shareholders, and the thing that they are sharing, the thing that they own collectively together, is something like a power grid or an airline. Right? These mechanisms are the alternatives to debt. Right? In the real world, in big finance, when you do these kinds of deals, there'll be some equity in the deal, there'll be some debt in the deal, there'll be some things which are a little like equity and a little like debt. There are lots of fine gradations in there. But what you get out of it is a situation where most of the time you don't just have to borrow all the money, You borrow some, and you also split the purchase with some other people, and at the end of that, you can do transactions at really huge scale. You know, if somebody's doing something like starting a new airline, they don't just go out there and borrow $100 billion and then go start a new airline. It's a complicated thing with lots of partial ownership, and there's often a publicly traded company in there, and that's how the real world works. That's how we built the world that we live in. So what tokenization does is it takes the transactional costs of doing those kind of deals down 10, 100, 1,000 times in time. So rather than, okay, we want to do this thing where we've got a bunch of equity partners and a bunch of debt partners, and we're all in this thing together, and it's going to cost us $350,000 in legal paperwork, you get something like that, but it's a set of operations done on DeFi, and it costs you, oh, I don't know, $18 worth of gas because you did it on one of the L2s. And that jump, right, you have to template the legals, you have to be working with a really well-established ecosystem. You know, it's going to take us a few years before we can get those prices down to those kind of levels. But when you can offer these kinds of things as services, okay, you want to buy a house, your grandparents and your parents and your cousins are going to put up 30% of the money for the house in exchange for so many shares of the house for this person, that person, the next person. That's what you're going to do instead of taking this enormous loan from the bank. You could get a smaller loan at a much better interest rate, and you could put together these kind of combined debt and equity packages for the day-to-day business of staying alive as an ordinary person that works for a living. It takes these super powerful tools from high finance and it brings them down as a way of replacing massive mortgages and credit card debt. It gets us out of a debt paradigm and into a debt and equity paradigm, or even a pure equity paradigm. And that really, really changes our relationships with each other, because not everything is then mediated by an adversarial relationship of who owes who money. These things then become mediated by a collaborative relationship, which is that we own this thing together. And that difference between whether things are kind of predatory and hostile and who owes who money, or whether they are collaborative and shared interest because we collectively own things we co-own together, cooperate, that changes the whole tone of your society. Debt society is hostile, co-ownership society is much, much more benign, much friendlier.
Of course, and yeah, as you also mentioned, democratizing access to fractional ownership of assets is going to revolutionize the world much more than the credit card itself did.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the credit card was a huge deal because before that, people only really had cash economies. So the first transformation was that ordinary people got access to debt. You got mortgages, then you got credit cards, and that fueled this enormous burst of people making long-term plans. I'm going to buy this thing on credit, I'm going to take out a loan, or I'm going to put it on my credit cards. And so people's lives speeded up enormously because they could bring money from the future into the present. I will take out a student loan. I will go to China on my credit cards, and I will spend 6 months learning Chinese. So the access to debt, and debt is the ability to move money across time, the access to debt hugely sped up society. We can't even imagine how slow the world was before credit cards, because if you were going to go to China and learn Chinese, you were going to have to save up for 10 years, and then you could go. Now, you go now, and then you take 10 years to pay off the credit card debt. Some people would say that has made our society worse rather than better, but it sure has made it different, right? Now you say, well, what happens if we start replacing this debt-based society and debt-based economy that we have now with a debt and equity-based economy? The transformation is already there. The credit cards are $42 trillion of transactions a year on credit cards. The numbers are staggering, right? Imagine a similar transformation where we give people access to equity as an instrument, right? It's a percentage of the entire mortgage market. It's a percentage of every car purchase. It might be a percentage of every time somebody buys resellable consumer electronics like laptops. That are just staggering things that can happen once you put equity on the table. And the level of social transformation I would expect to be larger than the social transformation caused by credit cards and the debt revolution.
Okay, I think that we have been exploring the tokenization side of the conversation quite deeply. Now, I would like to move on with the next topic, which is more related to DAO. So how basically your project is connected to the DAO form of governance. So how do you see institutions like DAOs reshaping collective ownership and governance of physical assets, and what challenges and opportunities does this pose?
So DAOs are, to me, the best example of an Ethereum technology which is poised to take over the world, and it just needs one more step, and then suddenly they're going to be everywhere. I know a lot of people in the DAO community had very high hopes for, oh my God, the DAOs will change everything. Wow. And then, a bit like Ethereum itself, they've had this phenomena where you just keep stamping on the accelerator and the wheels don't move. Again, it's the gearbox problem. DAOs also need a gearbox. So the sort of real world equivalent of the DAO is the publicly traded company, right? You buy a share of Facebook stock, you now have some economic rights. The Facebook board cannot just screw you over and disenfranchise you because you have legal protections, and they have to consider your wishes when they make decisions. Now, Facebook is kind of a bad example because the way that Facebook is structured gives Zuckerberg enormous, almost dictatorial powers, right? Facebook is a tough place to be a shareholder because they set it up that way. There are other companies which have very, very, very ordinary, standard, fair terms of engagement for shareholders. And in those situations, the shareholders have real economic rights. They can do things like get together and elect board members. And the board are basically like the supreme court of a company. Right? If you think of the CEO of the company as kind of like the president, the board are kind of like the Supreme Court. They sit over the president. They enforce law. Right? So the shareholders in a company are then kind of like the citizens, right? The citizens elect the Supreme Court and the president, and that's sort of how. Companies are a little different. They're not like countries. The shareholders pick the board then picks the CEO, right? It's kind of slightly democratic. In practice, it doesn't seem very democratic because the people that run large companies have gotten very good at fighting shareholder democracy. But in principle, shareholder democracy could work. Maybe one fine day. So the DAOs have the ability to automate this governance, right? You own some tokens in a project, you have some rights, there is some protection for your interests as a result of those economic rights. There's some contract law, there might even be some statute law. But these things all together create a situation where we are collectively governing an asset that we co-own together. Here is 1,000 acres of rainforest. 50,000 people own some of that rainforest. They collectively have voted that they're going to preserve that rainforest for the next 25 years, and they will not even consider selling land to any entity that isn't a better rainforest protector than the one they are currently themselves. And those rules can be written into the process, and then no future set of owners can change those rules because this stuff is immutable, right? All of that stuff, if you try and do it with lawyers, the time and the cost and the expense, if you try and get the voting done and people have to turn up at shareholders' meetings or they have to fill in proxy forms, it's hard, right? That's why shareholder democracy is not so effective in large companies, one of the reasons. But if all of that stuff was brought online and it was all managed through DAOs with properly set up legals and contract law and all the rest of this, proper voting rights, proper economic protection for minority token holders, the rest of these necessary steps, then what you get is an economic democracy revolution where all of the technology that's been worked out by the DAOs is suddenly applied to collective ownership of the world's assets. And the DAOs suddenly have an enormous amount of work to do in the real world. The software will get better and better and easier. And in 20 years, you could see hundreds of millions of people participating in DAOs in the same way that hundreds of millions of people participate in social media today. Right? We never really thought that individuals were going to go out there and become one-person movie studios, and now that's huge sectors of the economy. In the same way, you don't think that individuals are going to become like governance geeks and they're going to wind up managing investment portfolios and they're going to wind up as sort of stewards of planetary resources. But I think that that transformation is necessary and inevitable because we know that we cannot run the global economy in the way that we're doing it today. it's a disaster zone, and we can only fix that by re-democratizing the world. That doesn't just mean going to the ballot box and voting once every 4 years. It also means direct engagement and direct ownership of the world's productive assets, from the rainforests to the airlines, so that these things are well stewarded by the people that are affected by how they are run, rather than just being controlled by a very small corporate elite that does everything possible to make sure that shareholders have no actual power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this future where blockchain technology is going to enhance the concept of democracy. So basically, technology improving on the philosophical concept of democracy. That's very fascinating to me. But now I would like to move on to the next question, which is related to Mattereum's approach in bridging the gap between blockchain and real-world property. So how are you going to make this happen?
Well, so unusually for a crypto project, we're not talking about our future plans, right? We did it 2 years ago, and we've done it across a wide range of asset classes, pilot projects for 2 years, really 2.5 years at this point. We did the first NFTs tied to physical assets for William Shatner, years ago at this point, and that crossing point, right? Proper legals for control of a physical asset, so that when you buy the thing as an NFT, the physical asset legally changes ownership, and the lawyers can look at all those agreements and go, "Yeah, that's a transaction. That really happened. Courts will recognize it." That was a huge crossing point, right? And the most expensive thing that we've done that for was a $100,000 musical instrument, which is a trumpet from an Australian DJ called Timmy Trumpet. And you can go to YouTube and you can see this trumpet played, stadium after stadium after stadium after stadium, and Timmy sold it as an NFT for $100,000 to a fan, right? That's a huge deal, right? And this stuff is just, it really works. It's not a hypothesis. It's not a thing that we're going to do in the future. It's a practical reality. People can come to us right now and say, right, I want to sell this thing as NFTs, and we can walk them through how to do it. They bring a lawyer, they and the lawyer, we work with them. This is your asset, this is your jurisdiction, these are your legal responsibilities, this is what you're going to do with your tokens. We just help them understand how they could do this, and then they and their lawyers go through the process of doing it. Right? And the fact that they bring their own lawyers, I keep stressing that, because if you can't bring your lawyer to the table and do the transaction, no really heavy asset is ever going to be sold on chain. Right? The lawyers are the ultimate arbiters of physical reality. If they say no, the deal does not go. Right? It's the ability to get lawyers to say yes, which is at the heart of our competence. So, same thing when we start talking about doing securitization, right? Splitting of assets, fractionalization. You need the lawyers to say yes. And, chipping away at that problem, it's not easy to say to the lawyers, look, here's a completely new technology with a massively, wildly powerful set of new capabilities. How exactly are you going to do these deals? They have to be coached. You have to listen to what they say. You have to learn from what they say. You have to learn the language. Same thing with the regulators. You really have to soak yourself into this. And then at the end of it, you can come back with a proposal that says, okay, so we do this part with the technology, we do this part with contract law, we do this part with arbitration, we do this part with insurance. And you propose a deal structure, and the lawyers look at it and they say yes, and the commercial people look at it and they say yes. And then at that point, you have transactions. Right. And our intention here is, we don't think there need to be 50 companies like Mattereum, right? We want to just be there as the back end that powers the majority of the real world asset industry. Kind of like Amazon Web Services powered huge amounts of the .coms, huge amounts of the app economy. If you weren't on Amazon, you were on Google, and that was basically how everybody operated. We think there's a need for something like that in the blockchain space to help people get the assets into a transactable form. But we don't want to originate the deal flow for the entire tokenized economy on chain. That doesn't make any sense, right? Everybody can bring their deal flow to Mattereum. Mattereum will then figure out what we can or we can't do. We then get those things into the system as NFTs, as asset passports. These things could be securitized, fractionalized. All of those processes, we've envisaged this as being the platform that powers the entire real world asset industry. And then the real world asset industry could be 5,000 companies that have specialized knowledge, specialized access to buyers, specialized access to sellers, specialized expertise for valuing deals, putting deals together. And all of those companies go out there and they build these enterprises. And then at the back end, when the transactional magic has to happen, it comes to Mattereum, that's where it happens. And there are companies like this in the real world today. Crest handles stocks and shares. Visa handles credit cards. Swift handles big sort of like interbank payments and this kind of stuff. And all of those mechanisms, you have companies that are basically just pipe infrastructure that wire together the buyers and the sellers and provide evidence that value has transacted and everybody's lawyers agree that it's a safe deal. We view Mattereum as being like that for the entire real world asset industry and all of the fractionalization that comes with it.
Awesome. And now I would like to touch upon another piece of the puzzle. So the concept of asset passports. So Mattereum asset passports aim to provide information about the real world assets on chain. So could you walk us through how this technology works and the value it brings to users?
Sure, absolutely. So this is the thing that we invented first. We invented this before NFTs were a thing. This is from prehistory. It actually has roots in the Department of Defense project that I did. I'm trying to think, 2008, something like that. Right? It was a ways back, and the core model there is when you want to identify something in the real world using a computer, you have to have some kind of digital record that identifies the thing that is available and certifies what the object is. And if there's an error in that digital data, you don't want garbage in, garbage out. You want garbage in, insurance payment out. And that's a real paradigmatic shift, right? Garbage in, garbage out. You've got some records on chain. They tell you what you're going to get. You put your money in, and what comes back is nonsense. In the old world, what happens at that point is you're screwed. That's it. That's all that happened. Nothing happens, right? That's unacceptable. You cannot have a situation where somebody buys a house as an NFT or buys 20% of an office building as fractional tokens, and then they get nothing in return, and everybody is like, well, YOLO, you got rugged, right? No. In the real world, somebody does that, somebody's going to jail, right? You try and pull that kind of nonsense with, some, hardened bunch of New York real estate guys, their lawyers will basically sue your grandmother and take her cats. And that as an approach, this is the kind of tightening up in the discipline that is needed for the blockchain to take a real position in the real world. Right? Until a blockchain deal is considered to be more trustworthy and harder access to value than a real world deal, the real world asset people won't touch it. So what the Mattereum Asset Passport does is it nails down who is protecting the buyers in the deal. Right? And that is a simple statement, right? But those buyers are fully legally exposed. Their money is on the line. They say, you buy this token, you get this car. This car is in great condition. This car has no chips. It has no damage. The frame is straight. It hasn't been in a crash. This thing is for real. You buy the token. You take delivery of the car. You take a look at the car, and your mechanic is like, this has been through a chop shop, and this is made of two old broken cars that have been welded together and then coated in grease and sold. You're in trouble. Well, actually, no, I'm not in trouble. Yeah, this is a bad purchase, but now we're going to go and we're going to take the money of the people that said this was a good purchase. It's a very, very hardcore, disciplined, precise approach to making sure that when you buy something on chain, you get what you paid for. And the way that it works is you have a set of nominated third parties who all take responsibility for one part of the information about the asset. And in the event that the information that they give you is wrong, they give you money. And if they refuse to give you money, you can go through a claims process and you can take their money. And if those assets are in one of 172 countries, they can be seized by courts and handed to somebody as compensation. Right? This also applies to on-chain insurance, it applies to on-chain escrow, and in the future it will be applied to pools of assets that are on-chain. So you can take the gold bars that you own in a vault in Singapore, and you can pledge them to underwrite your own deals. If anything goes wrong in any one of these real estate deals that I'm doing, I have $500,000 worth of gold in Singapore, and it can be taken and handed to the party that is wronged in this instance. And all of this stuff runs under a set of international treaties that have been around for 60 or 70 years and run hundreds of billions of dollars of awards every year. This stuff is absolutely fundamental to how international business works. And the Mattereum asset passports are just ways of defining the assets exactly and pulling together all the pieces so you get these kind of airtight deals. And what we're aiming for here is a situation where I bought it on chain becomes almost very nearly as precisely a statement of value as one Bitcoin is always going to be worth one Bitcoin. Right? What we're looking for is the same kind of hardening of the assets and hardening the assets and hardening of the assets to the point where the asset is so hard, it's got so much insurance, it's got so much liability, it's got so much protection that you could take a Bitcoin out of your wallet and exchange it for the thing and not feel like you had taken a harder currency and exchange it for a softer one. Right? We have to bring the assets up to scratch to the point where you can transact them in return for incredibly hard assets like Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you mentioned how important it is that information related to the hard asset coincide with the information contained in the blockchain asset, so that these two sides of the metal coincide. And so I would like to ask you, how do you ensure that the accuracy and the security of the information that is linked to real world assets within the blockchain? So how do you ensure the accuracy and the security of this information?
So the critical word here is ensure, right? This is the crux of it, right? So the way that we think about it is when you buy something protected using the Mattereum system, your value, the amount of money that you wind up with at the end of the day, your net expected value, should be the same whether the asset is accurate, as described and perfect in every way, whether the asset is missing because it's been stolen, whether it's been destroyed, whether the asset is damaged, whether the asset is counterfeit. It doesn't matter what goes wrong in the deal, you should walk out with the same amount of money at the end. Right? Now, the only way that that is possible is if somebody else comes in and makes you whole and gives you money in the event that one of the bad things happens. And this is really a common arrangement. If you have gold and you give the gold to a vault to store and the vault gets robbed, they give you money. If you have a gold vault and they don't have insurance, there will not be a single gram of gold in that vault. Right? The vault is really a bridge to the insurance. Same thing if you're going to buy a house. The realtor has to give you real, accurate, honest, true information about the house. If the realtor lies to you about the house and then you purchase the house based on the bad information, you take them to court. Right? The problem that we have in the real world is that those mechanisms are really difficult and expensive to use. Right? When something goes horribly wrong in a real estate deal, the most common thing that happens that stops people being made whole in the process is that you sue somebody and then they go bankrupt. And at that point, it's like, oh, there's no money now, right? You can't go blood out of a stone. The company that did the deal went bankrupt. It has no assets. There's no value in there. And then at that point, you as the buyer of the real estate are just hosed. There's nothing you can do, generally speaking, right? So to make sure that that doesn't happen, what we have to get is a bunch of really, really big, heavyweight entities to hold on to the money, right? We're talking insurance companies, we're talking huge, like Dao style escrow contracts with thousands of people putting in hundreds of millions of dollars of value into pools, which are then used to underwrite deals. And when the deals go well, they get paid. When they go poorly, they have to make payouts. These things could essentially be like insurance syndicates. All of this infrastructure will be built out over the next 5, 10, 15 years to the point where you have an asset, you look at it on chain, you can see hundreds of different routes to get value in the event that the asset isn't described, depending on what goes wrong, where it goes wrong, when it goes wrong. You can audit on chain, presumably using artificial intelligence, exactly how all those routes to value work and how likely they are to be possible when you need them. And then you buy the asset with a very strong statistical basis for believing that your financial interests are protected when you purchase it. And this approach, the objective here is not to be as good as the real world, right? Real world real estate transactions are notoriously shoddy. They're slow, they're expensive, they're crappy, they're unreliable, they're uncertain. You never really know what you've got until 5 years after you bought it, and then you really hope that piles up into these huge piles of risk. So what we have to do on chain is we have to propose something which is fundamentally better than that, right? We have to get into a position where you buy something on chain and it's better than buying in the real world because it's more secure, right? And we cannot get this economy to lift off until we can make that promise and actually have it be heard and kept. Does that kind of make sense? I mean, this is a really, really different way of thinking about the blockchain, because we've seen so much fraud and misuse of the Ethereum technology in the past 5 years. Ethereum has become almost synonymous with fraud. You say to somebody, "Oh, I just bought some tokens on Ethereum, it's going to be great," and everybody assumes you've just been robbed. And this is a cultural disaster, right? If that was what I thought Ethereum was going to turn into, I would never have worked on it. I wouldn't go near it with a barge pole. What I was after was financial transparency, right? Transparency, accountability, trust, a body of transactional data that could be used to justly and fairly regulate the world. I really, really wanted us to make a better planet using these technologies. And you cannot do that in an environment where "I got rugged" is the end of a sentence, right? It has to be "I got rugged and then I made a claim on insurance. I got rugged and these people are now in jail. I got rugged and then I seized 40 pounds of gold bars to make up for the damages I'd taken." You cannot have "I got rugged" be the end of the story. And we have to get out of a culture where "I got rugged" is a thing that people say to each other as if that's the end.
Yeah, and actually, I would like to follow up on this topic because it's a very important one, and it has to do with the regulation. So, how to prevent these fraudulent activities. So, regulation plays a critical role in the asset tokenization space. And so, I would like to ask you, how is Mattereum addressing regulatory challenges and ensuring compliance while innovating in the blockchain realm?
So, generally speaking, as long as you are moving towards a fair trade environment, right, where some person pays for something and they get exactly what they paid for, if you're moving towards that, regulators, generally speaking, think that's a good idea. If you're a financial regulator, your job is to sort of make sure that people aren't defrauding each other, they're not conning each other, you're not making a mess of the future. So the way that we're doing what we do is we're using the building blocks of the existing financial system, right? Warranties, arbitration courts, the sort of frameworks of international business. We're taking these things and we're basically just bringing them across onto the blockchain in a way that the lawyers generally approve of, one step at a time, right? And what happens is that as you build out these institutional infrastructures, the blockchain becomes more and more and more the kind of place that real people can do transactions on, because you're not taking assets out into this Wild West environment. What you've done is you actually laid down the foundations, right? And again, I want to go back to the early days of Ethereum. Ethereum was going to have 4 phases, right? And this is the very early stuff. This is like pre-Genesis block, right? 4 phases. There was Frontier, which was we just put the chain up. We didn't know if it was going to be stable. We were hoping we could maintain consensus. We really crossed our fingers and hoped that it would hold together, right? Then there was Homestead, right? The chain had been up for a while. We were comfortable enough that it was going to stay up. We didn't anticipate any more hard forks. It was good to go. Start building. But the 2 steps that came after that were Metropolis and Serenity. Serenity was straight up proof of stake, right? We will no longer, contaminate the atmosphere with massive amounts of mining. We'll get into a position where this is a clean technology. Done. But Metropolis, we never made it to. And Metropolis was the idea that we were going to wind up with a really, really clean and usable user interface for the entire Ethereum system in the form of a web browser-like application called Mist. And Mist wound up with unfixable security problems. It was an approach that just couldn't work with that kind of technology, and it was one of the very few actual technological failures from the Ethereum project. What that's left us in is a position where you want to do transactions using MetaMask. And the problem with MetaMask is you get into a position where you're about to do the transaction and you kind of have to trust that the smart contract does what they say it does, because MetaMask doesn't have the tools for peeling a smart contract apart and telling you exactly what's going to happen to your money. But what I've noticed recently is that there are some new projects in the space which are sort of wallets that do a predictive analytics thing. They run the transaction on what amounts to a copy of the chain. They look at what actually happens, and then they tell you the actual full effect of executing the transaction. And those kind of tools take us towards the Metropolis reality, right? They take us into a situation where a financial regulator can look at the blockchain and say, look, they've got full transparency about what these transactions are going to do. They've got a very strong guarantee that if they click the button that says sign this contract, I agree, they know exactly what will happen to their assets. They've got insurance and warranties and arbitration tribunals and all the rest of these systems in place to make sure that there is a very, very strong claim on value if something goes wrong. Hey, this is actually safer than doing this stuff down on Wall Street. I don't see any reason we would give these people a hard time. Welcome to the club. You are now real finance, right? And that process, the stuff that's happening in Germany around Swarm, is a huge step forward in that process. But when you start pairing it up with these new generation secure transaction environments around Ethereum, you begin to set the preconditions for the Metropolis revolution. Right? We expected Metropolis to happen before Serenity. We thought we were going to get mass adoption and a browser-like environment before we got to proof of stake. As it happens, we got proof of stake first. That's great. And now we have to go back and we have to fill in the gaps and build the thing that Metropolis was always meant to be, which was a safe environment for mass adoption of Ethereum.
Okay, and now I would like to know more about your plans token, right? Because as far as I understand, you are also planning a token launch. So could you share a bit more details about this upcoming launch?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be more than delighted. So the first thing I want to say is that I don't talk about the token very much, and I try and talk about the token very, very, very carefully, because the legal issues around tokens are very, very complicated, and it's very easy to stick your foot in your mouth and wound up in the position that a lot of Hollywood celebrities wound up in, where they were suddenly being called to answer for their words. So if I seem like I'm being a little careful here and not saying things in the kind of massively enthusiastic way that you're used to hearing people talk about their tokens in, be aware that part of what goes along with trying to do things in a way which is a bit more diligent and careful is that you cannot just go out there and tell people this thing is going to go to the moon, you should sell your dog and buy this token. You just can't do it, because these things may turn out not to be true, and everything is about having a really clear understanding. So how are we going to do this, right? We've gone through 2 massive bull markets without issuing a token. Right? If we had been a bunch of scumbags, we could have issued a token on crappy legals in 2018. We probably would have gotten away with it. A lot of people did, right? We could have issued it at the middle of the NFT hype. We could have kicked a token out there on crappy legals. We probably would have gotten away with it. A lot of people did, right? The reason we haven't done this is, frankly, I'm interested in much bigger game, right? I keep explaining to folks around, Mattereum. Look, Mattereum as $100 million company, from my perspective, is a failure, right? It's just not good enough. It's not going to do what I need it to do. What I'm looking for is Mattereum as a core piece of financial infrastructure for the entire planet. I want it to be in the same category as Crest, Swift, Visa, right? Huge financial infrastructure, because this is the scale that is required to turn Ethereum and the blockchain as a whole into a daily part of everyday life. And I genuinely believe that we can fix many or even most of the political problems in the world by moving from a debt-based economy to an equity-based economy, and moving from an untransparent financial infrastructure to fully transparent financial infrastructure. Right? So I am a true believer right? You know, blood, sweat, and tears, largely in obscurity for most of a decade to implement the original Ethereum vision fully. But it needs a bridge, and it needs a massive bridge. So if we're going to get there, we cannot do a flaky token issue on shoddy legals and then expect that to not bite us much later in the pathway when people start looking at this and like, these tokens, was that really legal at the time it was done? Well, sure, right? And we just can't go down that path. So we've had to put our feet extremely carefully and extremely slowly. And to be honest, Swarm is the critical thing here. The fact that they've got the necessary licensing, they can do all the stuff that T0 was hoping to do, they can do all the stuff that Bittrex Global was hoping to do, they can do all the stuff that Artrax was hoping to do, but they can do it in a way that's really relatively easy to use and very accessible. You know, it's really very close to the thing that everybody has been promising, but it never really seemed to land in a way that was fully ready to go. The Swarm thing, all praise to them. They are incredible. It's fully ready to go. So, and actually, I want to be clear that it's not just fully ready to go, it's fully going. You could go there and you could buy Tesla stock. You could buy US government T-bills, right? You could go there and buy various kinds of mining pool stuff, right? I mean, you sort of don't expect to go to a crypto exchange and see them selling Tesla stock, but it's actually happening. Fully regulated. I mean, this stuff is staggering, right? I mean, it's completely mind blowing that they've done this. And by the way, they also have their own token. So their token was very close in design to the Mattereum token that we had been working on designs for now and again over the years. And that was because both tokens were shaped by a similar understanding of the legal environment and the likely regulatory situation. So, in terms of how the Mattereum token will work, all I can say is look at the Swarm token. It has been shaped by the same forces. It is being delivered by some of the same infrastructure. The Mattereum token will be on Swarm. And if you want to understand kind of sort of the sorts of things our token will work and how the tokenomics are likely to be, take a look at the Swarm token because that one worked in the way that it's meant to. It's a pretty clean way of doing this. So that is probably all that I ought to say in terms of the details of the token. In terms of the time scales, quite soon, right? Like when we put together the plan, we sort of looked at Q3 and said, cross your fingers, maybe. Slippage into Q4 was expected. We have slippage into Q4. I think it is very unlikely that we would see slippage into Q1 of next year. I don't want to give anybody dates. I don't want to talk about timelines too much. But the way that it will work is there will not be massively heavy marketing, branding, and promotion initially, right? There'll be some quiet announcements. If you're interested in getting those announcements, get signed up to our mailing list, get onto our Telegram channel. But there will be a point where we just say, okay, go over to Swarm, get your KYC, AML, etc. sorted out over there. We have some good news, right? And there will be a time period when it's just very, very quiet. Off you go. And then there will be some announcements. And there will be some announcements like, hey, here are some gold bars. Here is some real estate. Here is some fine art. I'm not going to say for sure exactly what and when. Obviously, all of those things have buyers and sellers, and we have to conclude those deals and do the listings and all the rest of the things that we have to do. All of that has to be done, right? The asset passports have to be prepared. Those companies have to get their lawyers to agree. Like there are no hard promises, but as we begin to get really serious product on chain, then we begin to talk about the Mattereum token much more. If you would like to go and buy these gold bars, there is a Mattereum discount token. You can do the transaction for less money than if you didn't use the token. And at that point, marketing the Mattereum service, and by the way, the token is kind of like air miles, this is the sort of thing that starts to actually work, right? Because putting a huge amount of PR behind a token is not a product, right? A service is a product. We want to put the energy behind the service and pull the token behind the service, because if people are using the service in a massive way, the token is an economically efficient thing for them to do, right? What we're sort of trying to avoid is something which is largely driven by marketing rather than by delivery, right? It's a very, very, very delicate balance, because it's just much safer legally, and it's much safer culturally, emotionally, to tell people about things after you've done them than to lay out an enormous roadmap about what you expect to happen, tell everybody it's going to happen, and then cross your fingers you can deliver. Right? So this is the kind of trajectory that we're on. And if you ask me, like, how is the token going to do and what will happen in the market, all I can really say is this, right? From our perspective, being able to get trillions of dollars real world assets onto the blockchain has been what the Ethereum ecosystem has needed from the beginning. And if we succeed in getting the first chunk of those assets on chain in a way that makes it obvious the rest can be done and it will scale, we will be looking at a rebirth for the entire Ethereum ecosystem as part of the real world. So cross your fingers that we can deliver what we think we can deliver, but if we can, it is going to be the beginning of a whole new round of evolution.
Yeah, and I love the big ambitions of the project. I think that's what we should aim for. But yeah, like, I think we are running out of time, so I would like to just give you, Vinay, the opportunity to share some final thoughts about what your community should look forward to in the next few months.
Sure. So here, take a look at our recent press releases, right? Take a look particularly at our partnerships. I want to draw attention to two deals in particular. So the first is NeoSwap, John Ennis's firm. So NeoSwap is a bunch of folks with PhDs who are very into their math, and they're very into mechanism design and algorithms. And also, by the way, AI. We haven't talked very much about AI. Hopefully, we'll do another one of these where we'll really get into blockchain and AI legal. And I think that the conclusions we reach there will be completely mind-blowing. But that's for the future. So NeoSwap are doing things like reinventing how auctions work. And you think of, auctions as a mechanism. This is a really old mechanism. I don't even know when the first auction was, but it's probably more than thousands of years ago. I mean, it's certainly more than 1,000 years, I bet. So what they're doing is they're reinventing auctions so that you can have multiple buyers and multiple sellers at the same auction, but rather than having a situation where everybody has to sort of wait for the thing to sell before they know how much money they have to buy with, everybody goes around and sticks a price tag on everything they're interested in, and then everybody decides whether they're going to accept the price or not, and the algorithm then figures out what transactions to do to maximize the value going through the system. And it's this kind of weird thing of like, it's like a parallel computer version of an auction. And the underlying math is quite mind-blowing. You also need to use a whole bunch of AI stuff to maximize the probability that people will say yes to the deals that are proposed. But what it allows for is the potential for staggeringly capital efficient trade. A bunch of people with commodities, a bunch of people with gold, a bunch of people with currencies, a bunch of people with real estate, a bunch of people with equity in public companies, all bring these things to the table, price the other stuff that other people have and decide what they're interested in, and then you run a batch transaction and all this stuff gets swapped around on a single exchange. Oh my God, right? Right now, if you want to sell, wheat futures, that's happening on one exchange. If you want to sell IBM stock, it's happening on another exchange. If you want to sell gold, it's happening somewhere else. All of these marketplaces are totally split up and balkanized. And what the NeoSwap folks are pointing at is this idea of cross-marketplace liquidity for real-world assets with massively well-worked-out algorithmic optimization of the trade. This stuff is a big freaking deal. So I highly recommend taking a close look at what NeoSwap are doing. A little like Mattereum, they tend not to promise a lot. So you go over there and you look and it's like, NFTs being traded for tokens. Huh. Their ambition is a re-architecture of the entire financial system around new algorithms. So everything in the world that is market priced or auctioned suddenly is embedded in this new trade infrastructure. Staggering, right? Another crypto real estate, 1,700 properties already priced in Bitcoin and Ether, right? You can imagine, you start thinking about these things as NFTs, you start thinking about the possibility of securitization, you put all of that stuff together, something very new happens in real estate. And by the way, they have property all over the world, right? crypto real estate, go take a look at what they've got, go take a look at what's happening over there, take a look at the announcement we made with those folks, sort of think, you got crypto real estate over here, you got Swarm over there, there's a bunch of very, very exciting, as yet unannounced gold stuff. I cannot say more than that. It is unannounced. It may never happen, but it sure looks like it might. And you sort of think, well, okay, we got real estate over here, we got gold over here, we got all of this tokenized equity in companies like Tesla as well accessible because it's already trading on Swarm. You begin to see the possibility for a universal exchange with algorithms that you cannot get access to on the New York Stock Exchange or the Chicago Board of Trade or anywhere else in the world for cross-asset class liquidity, right? I really can't emphasize this enough. We're not talking about being the coolest thing on the blockchain. We're talking about being the coolest thing in the world. And that's not, hey, Mattereum. That's Mattereum, it's NeoSwap, it's Swarm, it's crypto real estate, a lot of other companies that are all getting to grips with this real world asset thing and this algorithmic trading thing in different ways. The AI folks will be along for the ride pretty soon. And what comes out of that is something that will make the history of Ethereum so far look like the blue touch paper on a firework the size of a car. Because when it goes off, it's the world financial system poured onto the Ethereum blockchain because that's where the algorithms are that can actually execute your trade most efficiently, and the financial system will route the transactions onto the most efficient trading infrastructure it can find because that's what the financial system is for.
Okay. Vinay, I think this is a good moment to wrap up the discussion. So I really hope that we are going to see soon the coolest thing in the world materialize, as you defined it. And yeah, I would like just to thank everyone, all the listeners. Apologize for the initial technical issues of the AMA. I would like to thank you, Vinay, for sharing your time and your experience with us. So before we say goodbye, I would like you to share with our audience how people could keep in touch with Mattereum's updates, and if they're interested, how they can contact your team.
So Twitter, Mattereum Twitter, you can see they're here. I'm also on Twitter. Twitter is a good way to get hold of us. I should call it X now. X. We do have a Telegram group. It is not terribly active. Email is fantastic. So Telegram, come over there, talk to us, make it more active. We would love that. Email, there is a mailing list. You could get on the mailing list. We will send you regular information about what's going on. That is the definitive place if you just want to get an occasional message about what's happening. You come to the Telegram group, we will tend to diverge quite a bit and talk about other things. And sales at Mattereum.com if you're interested in getting your assets to market. You all know how massively fraud prone and dangerous the blockchain environment is when it comes to people doing things like posting crypto keys and telling you to send your money to them right now because you could get Mattereum tokens early. No, you can't. Never do it. Don't touch up the barge pole. Never do any of that stuff, right? So that's basically how everything works, right? You contact us by email. You tell us what's happening. I think that's basically everything we need to know. Anything else?
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I will look forward to see the developments of the tokenization of assets in the next years. And yeah, thanks a lot, Vinny, for joining the discussion. Thanks everyone for listening, and hopefully see you soon on the next Cointelegraph show.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.